It has been an unprecedented time in the WNBA and in the world right now. But before we get started with the incomparable Annie Costabile, I'd like to first say that this week was a difficult one for many. It might be a joyful week for others, but I know it has been a difficult week for many. And in light of that, I'd like to offer this show as a distraction. We'll talk about the league and the sport that a lot of you listening love and can't get enough of. The women's basketball community remains a place of excitement and joy, and we will continue that here at Locked On Women's Basketball to make it as such. When times were really hard for me personally in 2018 and 2019, it was this community that brought me out of times that were scary and hopeless. So it is my hope that this community can bring you, if you are feeling full of doubt and void of hope, some joy and some respite from what we've been experiencing this week. But anyway, we have huge news to break down and older news to analyze. Curt Miller is taking the reins in Dallas as the executive vice president and general manager. Annie is going to describe to us how Stephanie White and Tyler Marsh landed, and much, much more. So without further ado, the Locked On Women's Basketball Podcast, it starts right now.
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome. You are Locked On to Women's Basketball. I'm Jackie Powell. And yes, it is Friday. Maybe a happy one, may not be for some. Both are fine. I'm one of your hosts on this program. I cover the New York Liberty at The Next, and I've covered women's basketball nationally at many other places. We want to thank you for making this show your first listen every day. And remember that Locked On Women's Basketball is brought to you by everyone at The Next, a place where we cover this sport all the time, and we tell the stories that need to be told each day. Subscribe now for $9 a month or $72 per year. Find us at thenexthoops.com and subscribe. Also, please remember that Locked On Women's Basketball is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and more. And now some of your favorite podcasts have newsletters. So introducing the Locked On Daily Newsletter, the Locked On NBA Daily Newsletter. Your favorite podcasts now have a newsletter. So introducing Locked On NBA for your one-stop ultimate team and league coverage delivered right to your inbox. Sign up for free now at lockedondaily.com. That's lockedondaily.com. Today's show is brought to you all by Prize Picks. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNBA to win $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks. Run your game. The last time we were together, dear listener, which to be quite honest, felt like more than just 2 weeks ago, I took you all inside what was a historic day for the WNBA and women's basketball and for women's sports. The Liberty had the first ever ticker tape parade down the Canyon of Heroes for a women's sports franchise in New York. It was a special moment and a very special episode. But anyway, moving on to what we are discussing today, I have brought on the person who really set a lot of wheels in motion when it comes to the coaching carousel and front office realignment. Someone who has helped provide a lot of reporting about why and how by April of 2025, we are going to see 7 new head coaches for their teams. So in segment 1, we're going to react a little bit to the latest news about Curt Miller. Segment 2, we're going to get deep into what Annie has been following so closely, which is how Stephanie White and Tyler Marsh landed in Indiana and Chicago, respectively. And then in segment 3, we're going to talk about what's next because there are more positions to be filled during this crazy time. So, Annie, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it. I think I want to start with Curt Miller. How do you react to this news that he is taking over not only as general manager, but as a vice president as well?
I think considering Dallas's situation in terms of Greg Bibbs' role over, the last few years, I think in that regard, it's exciting to consider a person like Curt Miller stepping into that role. Because he's proven at roster construction. He won Executive of the Year. What was that, in 2017? So it was back in 2017, 2018 that he won Executive of the Year. So I think when you consider it from that perspective, it's exciting because they need someone like him, right? They need somebody who's going to be able to make Dallas successful from a roster construction standpoint, because as we've seen over the last few years, the rosters that have been put together have not really been great. There's been flashes of greatness, and there's obviously star players that they've been able to bring in, but it's never reached an extremely successful place. But the question that I have, or I guess the thought that keeps coming to my mind with this news is, what is the W going to be like without Coach Curt Miller in the mix? Because that's, I think, the role that he's always led with. Even when he was in a dual role, it was always, he was always thought of, I think, as the coach, not necessarily, the GM first. And so I think it's interesting that he was willing to give up a coaching title. And, I can't wait to talk to him whenever that comes about, what exactly went into his decision in terms of giving that up and why he was willing to make that sacrifice now, right? Because we all make sacrifices in our careers. We all, choose new directions. So why was right now the right time for him to do that?
An excellent question to ask him. What I can say in response to that is a source familiar with the situation told me that this was very difficult for Curt to make that decision.
Yeah.
And the reason for that was there are some other opportunities that he would maybe like to explore, if that's an assistant or a head coach for one of the national teams that will compete in the 2028 Olympics in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. So the complication is that for Team USA to be an assistant on that bench, and to clarify, he was a scout for Paris this past summer. Mm-hmm. And so in order for him to be able to move up to be an assistant coach, apparently there are some rules about, well, how long can a coach on USA be, coach in the WNBA? Do they qualify if they are an executive rather than a coach? Those are some questions that were, that are actively still going on. I mean, we saw that Mike Thibault, who for the past couple of years was a general manager rather than a head coach, was able to be an assistant coach on that USA basketball bench. So the question is, will that exception be extended to someone like Curt Miller? We don't know. And that was something that was making this decision tough for him. So that is an excellent, excellent thought, because clearly that is something that was going on in his mind.
Right. And I mean, again, he's accomplished extreme success as a coach. So any transition like that, when you've already reached certain mountaintops, it doesn't come easily. It doesn't matter what industry you're in. If you've accomplished a certain level of success and then take a redirection, it comes with challenges. So I can't speak to what those challenges were for Curt, but, he's still in the WNBA, and I know that's a priority for him. So this opportunity will certainly take him in a new direction. We don't know entirely what direction that is, but for now it's strictly as the front office executive. We've seen him have success in the past. So we'll see where he's able to take the Dallas Wings.
For sure. I mean, the one thing I think that we all know from, covering Curt, listening to what he has to say, he loves building. That's something he loves to do. And so initially he thought he was really going to be given that chance in Los Angeles, a city that he loves. He loves the beach. But no, he wasn't given, that leeway to build in the way that he knows he can. So here's an opportunity for him to build in Dallas. And I think before we move to a quick break in our second segment, I think my big question is, what exactly will Greg Bibbs' role be in all of this? How much of a voice in the room will he be? How hands-on, how hands-off will he be? And that is a question that, I will continue to ask. I mean, Greg Bibb was the main executive behind the Dallas Wings' rosters. I mean, ever since the Wings moved to Dallas. So what is that going to look like? We're talking about changes in Curt's career. What are those changes going to look like for Greg Bibb too? Let's take a short break. We will be back with Annie, and we're going to be talking about how Stephanie White and Tyler Marsh both landed. But first, I do want to talk to you all about one of our sponsors, and that is Prize Picks. So you can win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks with as little as 4 correct picks. Prize Picks is the best way to get action on sports in over 30 states, including California, Florida, Georgia, and Texas. Sign up today and get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to receive $50 bonus. It's guaranteed. Prize Picks also offers weekly promotions that can lead to big payouts like Taco Tuesday each Tuesday. So think, will Steph Curry get more than 4 3-pointers next week? What about Juju Watkins? What about Paige Beckers? Cook up hot takes with your friends and win real money this college and pro basketball season when you and your crew run your game on Prize Picks. Well, thank you very much, Prize Picks. We appreciate you. Now, I do want to talk to you all about our good friends at FanDuel. So, get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel America, FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place bets on in the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That is FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Thank you, FanDuel. We appreciate you. And now we are back with Annie Costabile. And so now let's get into the other hires that have been finalized and announced. And those are Stephanie White landing in Indiana and Tyler Marsh landing in Chicago. Annie, let's first start with Stephanie White. I mean, you were on the front lines. You knew that something was happening. Take us through sort of this reporting process and, how you were able to really put together this story about her move back to Indiana.
Yeah, so honestly, it started because the Sky were looking for a coach, right? So you start contacting your sources about who could be available and who the Sky would even be interested in. And so I mean, the first piece of information I got was just that Stephanie White might not return to the Connecticut Sun. And so that was kind of a big question, or I guess I shouldn't say it was a question, or even that it was shocking to hear, because I think something we need to start like talking about or getting comfortable with is that in the W, just like other sports leagues, like if you're great at your job, you can be poached at any time. And that's not shameful. That's not wrong. Like that's the name of the game, right? Like teams want to be successful. We don't have to tiptoe around it. Like by any means necessary means by any means necessary. And it's okay for women's sports teams to be that competitive. And so when I first heard like, oh, Stephanie might not return to the Sun, my thought was like, do the Sky really have a shot at her, right? Because the Sky's history since winning their title has been anything but glamorous and has been anything but top tier. And when you're talking about a coach like Stephanie, she's a top tier coach. So for me, it really started with, again, trying to understand the landscape that included the Sky. And once I started to hear, you know, where Stephanie was, which team Stephanie was talking to, it kind of became clear, okay, this is where she's going to end up, right? She's from Indiana. Family obviously was a huge factor in her decision. And I think the other thing is when you consider her having that last year on her contract in Connecticut, is franchises don't want to be pegged as the team that won't let that's holding someone that doesn't want to be there, right? Because if you have a coach who's expressed a desire, again, I'm just using a coach as an example because we're talking about Stephanie here. If you have any employee who's expressed a desire to be elsewhere and you're not able to either match what they're being offered or create a circumstance where they want to be there, what purpose does it serve to, you know, prevent them from going and pursuing other opportunities, right? Because I think a lot of times when we're talking about coaches pursuing other opportunities, I could use James Wade as an example. You know, when he was talking to the Toronto Raptors, he obviously talked with the Sky about it, and they said, go ahead and have these conversations. They were in the know about it. And it doesn't serve anybody to prevent those conversations from happening, right? Because I've gotten a lot of questions about that. Well, why would the Sun allow her to go out and talk to other teams? It's like, well, why wouldn't they if she's expressed a desire to potentially be elsewhere? So, yeah, I mean, it started as just an interest, you know, to be closer to home. And then I think once it became clear that there were actually going to be opportunities to make that happen, it's, you know, the fever made all the sense in the world.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that a little bit, I mean, there have been other situations in the league's history where you have executives that don't allow their coaches to speak to other teams. I've heard that has happened before, especially with the Connecticut Sun under previous leadership. So, you know, Jen Rosati allowed Stephanie White to talk to other teams. It was a courtesy that, you know, did not happen in the past under different leadership. So anyway, that is how Stephanie White returned to Indiana. You know, I mean, the Indiana Fever are making moves. They, you know, let their head coach, Christy Sides, go. I can report that they are going to be paying Stephanie White's final year on her Sun contract and Christy Sides' final 2 years. So clearly they have the money to do this. But Annie, take us inside what some are calling the Tyler Marsh sweepstakes. You know, how were the Sky able to convince him to sign on after he was courted by other teams?
Yeah, so something that I just think is important to emphasize is Jeff Pagliacca had an uphill battle in terms of selling this position. And when I'm talking about how were they able to even entice Stephanie White into a conversation, because she spoke directly to Jeff multiple times, that also applies to a candidate like Tyler Marsh, because you're talking about someone who has championship experience, who was in the WNBA working on the bench of arguably, the top coach in the league, one of the top coaches in the league. Why would you want to leave that? You couple that with the fact that the Aces are a top tier franchise in terms of investment. Tyler could have waited this out and gotten any opportunity or waited to see what other opportunities presented themselves. Right. And that's something that Becky Hammond told me the other day when I spoke to her, is that she had confidence that if this wasn't the job for him, there were going to be opportunities that presented themselves a year from now. So there was no reason that Tyler had to jump this quickly for a head coaching job. Right. And so to me, when you know that, what is it about this job with the Sky that makes this so that made you willing to jump for this opportunity? Right. And so I think when you consider that question and you consider the experience that Tyler has, the fact that he was willing to take this job speaks to his belief in the direction that the franchise is headed, and also his ability to influence that direction. Like, something this reminds me a lot of is when the Sky hired James Wade. They were hiring an assistant who had player development experience, who came from a championship coaching tree, and someone who, again, had learned from greats, right? And of course, he didn't have head coaching experience at the time, but they were bringing someone on who was a sponge to like the greatness around him. But what I don't think like has been talked about enough is that the Sky were also hiring a man who was going to hold the franchise to an elite expectation, right? Because when you come from championship, you have a championship pedigree, you know what it takes to operate at that standard. And I think that's what the Sky still needs. What's been proven in these last 3 years since the title is that they need somebody who's going to be in this position that's going to hold the entire franchise accountable and have an expectation of how things should be run and make sure that they actually are run that way. And so a lot of people have questioned, well, Tyler doesn't have head coaching experience. You're right. There's going to be a learning curve there. But he does come from a championship background. And so he knows what the standards should be. And I think that is going to translate exceptionally well here in Chicago. Again, when you consider that things have not been running smoothly over the last year and a half.
Yeah, that's excellent and fascinating reporting. I mean, one of the questions I have, in addition to one that you brought up, which is he has not been a head coach before, and the Chicago market comes with a lot of pressure. This Chicago ownership group, they expect in short periods of time for success to happen. So I think what I'm most curious about is, how does Tyler Marsh do in a high pressure situation? How much of a voice does he have when it comes to holding the franchise accountable and holding the people who he reports to accountable? That is what I'm really curious about.
Yeah, I'm laughing because it's so funny when you consider, again, like the press releases that get put out and the expectation that gets put out. Like, we're a championship organization. You guys won a championship in 2021. You did so because a hometown legend returned. You had a coach that she wanted to play for, a coach that helped your other stars remain loyal to the franchise. It was all these outside factors that made the Chicago Sky a title team, right? It wasn't ownership. It wasn't because they built this exceptional place that everyone wanted to be. Candace Parker wanted to be here because she's from here. And so when you think about, again, that standard that's being kind of put out in these press releases, I think you got to ask ownership, or the question to ownership is, what are you doing to ensure that your employees are actually being put in a position to win, and to win consistently and to win titles consistently? Are you doing that? Because that's what ownership, that's the standard ownership needs to hold themselves, right? And so when you see the press release and it's talking about, we have a championship standard. Okay. Do you? Like, really? Do you? And so of course, Tyler is someone who they expect to be a championship winning coach. I don't think that the timeline is this quick turnaround timeline, realistically speaking. I don't think in the next year this is going to be a team that's competing for a championship. I do think Tyler's impact on young players like Camila Cardoso and Angel Reese is going to have an immediate impact, and we're going to see a team that's more successful in 2025. Does that mean they're going to be immediately competing for a title? No, but I think 2025 is going to be really critical for them in terms of rebuilding towards that championship caliber.
For sure. Before we quickly hop over to looking ahead to what's next in all of these front office and coaching carousel situations, I do just want to quickly touch on maybe what we see as concerns for Stephanie White, which that was something that I skipped over. I know for me, quickly to sum up, Stephanie White is an excellent schematic coach, but we have not seen how she does when she's dealing with a younger core and a younger roster that doesn't have the veteran leadership already in place. Mm-hmm. So I'll be really interested to see who she hires in order to foster some of that player development. I mean, as you said, Tyler comes from player development. That is his bread and butter. How does Stephanie White deal with that?
Yeah, I think the reason I'm not concerned there is because we've seen so many franchises be successful with coaches who are not necessarily the player development type of coaches, but then they fill that hole by whatever assistants they hire, right? So whatever experience you're lacking, that's you make up for it on your bench. And so again, looking at a person like Tyler, I think this is a prime example of how a coach like Stephanie could make that up, is by finding the right person to come in and be her head of player development.
Anyway, let us transition into our final segment.
Locked On Women's Basketball is brought to you by Stims for Men. So, look, Stims has been around for a long time. We've had it for women. Now Stims is making underwear for men as well. Whatever size you're looking for, whether it's the cotton boxer brief, the stretch 5-inch boxer brief, there's even cotton 3-inch, stretch even Stims cotton brief, period. Whatever you need in order to feel comfortable throughout your day, Stims has underwear for men that allow you to get it. Go ahead and shop Stims Men's at stims.com. Let them know we sent you. After you place your order, select podcast in the survey and select our show in the drop-down menu that follows. And if you're looking for perfect gift for the whole family, Stims just launched their biggest holiday shop ever, also available at stims.com.
Anyway, so yes, I am back here with Annie, and we are now going to break down what's next. So we've discussed who has been hired, but there are a lot of roles to be filled here. So Annie, what do you know? What have you been hearing about the openings in Connecticut, in Atlanta, in LA, in Washington? A lot of openings. An opening in Las Vegas for their general manager, another opening in Washington. There's a lot.
Yeah, there are a lot of openings. And I think the interesting thing that I've been discussing with different sources is just the pool of candidates, which we saw The Athletic reported or put out a great story that kind of broke down where and why the pool of candidates has kind of diminished over the last decade. even longer, why this pool has just been so shallow for so long. So that's definitely a great story to go take a look at if you're interested in understanding this better. But for me, the interesting thing that I continue to hear is how much consideration is being given to assistants right now, because we've kind of seen in the WNBA how when these when there are coaching vacancies, there's more of a shuffle that takes place versus new candidates being entered into the mix. And that doesn't always lead to success, right? We've seen the shuffling that happens, and then a year later, 2 years later, a shuffling happens again. And so I think the biggest question that these franchises need to answer, and we're seeing them answer with the hiring of Natalie Nakase and Tyler Marsh here in Chicago, is it actually a long-term answer to bring in one of these coaches that has been fired, or is the answer to look outside of the pool that's kind of on everybody's radar and create your own pool, essentially? And so when it comes to LA and them using a firm to conduct their coaching search, you got to think that, that means that they're talking about more than just the obvious pool in front of them, college coaches, overseas coaches, and then assistants here, NBA caliber coaches. So I think the biggest question for these franchises to answer is the pool of candidates. Like, who are you actually considering, and should you be considering candidates from different areas?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, and I will attach the link to that story in the show notes, along with a link so you can see all of Annie's reporting. But I think what's really interesting is there are rumblings about, okay, are college coaches willing to come back over to the W? Are college coaches who don't have a lot of NIL money at their institution, are they looking at the WNBA as an opportunity that maybe they'd like, because they've been burnt out and tired by having to recruit all year long? So that, I mean, I've heard that the Connecticut Sun are looking at some of those college coaches who maybe don't have the NIL money that LSU or, UConn has, or South Carolina. So, I mean, that is a direction different franchises are going in. Also, if you take a look at the situation in Phoenix with Nick Uren, he sort of came from a situation where he wasn't being elevated in Golden State when he was with the Warriors. And so WNBA front offices are thinking, okay, maybe there's some other people within different NBA circles, if they're assistant coaches or just people within basketball operations who aren't being elevated. I mean, we saw that happen with Becky Hammond, right? The reason she came back to the W was because she was not being elevated. So it's like this cyclical thing. Like, I know in that story in The Athletic that Ben and Sabrina wrote, they talked about the history of the W and how in the beginning of the league's history, you had all of these former NBA players who were being passed over to be coaches in the NBA. I mean, Bill Laimbeer, that's a great example. But I mean, I can say that Atlanta is also using a firm. They are looking all around.
Again, because the pool is so small, these franchises have an uphill battle in terms of determining who's qualified, who's capable of leading their franchise. And again, the turnaround in terms of what we've seen as the window that a lot of franchises are being offered to have coaches prove their success is about a 2-year window. So there's not a huge runway for candidates to prove that they're ready and that they're capable.
Yeah, and you get into a bit of I don't know if it's a chicken or the egg type situation, but especially when there's some franchises that are looking at former players. They're looking at these former WNBA players who have retired as potential candidates because they know that their players like playing for someone who has had WNBA experience, that knows what it's like to play in this league. You know, folks like Christy Tolliver and Breon January, who actually took a role with a G League team. Those are names that are being floated around as potentially the next generation of WNBA coaches. But it all begs the question, as you were saying just now, how much of a runway will they be given? How much time will they be given to prove themselves? Will they be given enough time to build and to learn and to grow? I mean, with the amount of firings that occurred this past fall, the answer to that question, maybe not.
Yeah, that's why it's all about the right opportunity, right? You aligning with whatever job it is you're pursuing. It's like it doesn't often take, it's not a 2-year window is not always the window in which you can turn things around immediately. So I think the question that candidates have to answer is whether or not they're in alignment with ownership in terms of what the expectation is. Because again, candidates like Christy Tolliver and Breon January, who have been floated around a ton, that's going to be important for them when you're considering taking your first head coaching job. So it'll be interesting to see how things shake out.
Oh, yeah. And we will be keeping our eyes and ears looking at all of it. But anyway, thank you all for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen today. Our favorite podcast now has a newsletter. Introducing Locked On NBA Daily Newsletter, your one-stop shop for ultimate team and league coverage delivered right to your inbox. Sign up for free at lockedondaily.com. That's lockedondaily.com and start your day with the all-new free Locked On newsletters. I want to give a huge thank you and shout out to Annie for hopping on the show. Annie, please tell all of the good people where they can find your work.
You guys can find my work at the Chicago Sun-Times, or you can follow me on social media if you'd like to.
Well, anyway, this has been Jackie Powell and
Annie Costabile.
And we are signing off. We hope you have a restful weekend.
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.